everyone who's joining. It's great to see you. There's a Q&A button and tab. If you want to share a question, we'd be happy to hear your voice and welcome you to the stage to dive in. Before I pose a couple questions around the topics of our session, I'm curious for you, Dave. Like Joe just shared, his path to activism was a combination of influences growing up as well as a defining moment. And I'm just curious, in your journey, what were the influences, if any, from your parents or your milieu as a young person that may have shaped your commitment to environmental activism? And then was there a moment, was there the defining moment or experience that was your commitment moment?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to think about. I mean, I feel like I've always kind of been in it in some way. I grew up, I was a little kid in the 60s, and I was kind of aware of what was going on in all of the movements of the 60s, the anti-war movements and the sort of fledgling ecology movement. I remember in 1970 I must have been 11 years old, going with the teenagers who on Earth Day were cleaning out old tires and crap from a pond in the woods near where I lived. And, that's sort of my earliest memory of being an environmental activist. And I didn't, I think, grow up knowing exactly what I would do, but I always had this feeling like I needed to help people and do the most important thing I could. And when I was in college, I had to take an environmental science course just to satisfy the distribution requirements. And I got exposed to, frankly, all the very same issues that we're grappling with now, and thought, all right, if I'm really serious about doing the most important thing I can, this is the most important thing. You can't do anything else if you don't, have a planet to live in. So I asked my professor how I would do it, what kind of job would I get? And he basically said, do this, this, and this, and I'll be your advisor. And yeah, that took off from there.
That is awesome. Where were you for your first Earth Day? Was that in New York or?
Yeah, Hastings-on-Hudson, New York.
Totally. Great. Cool. Well, I have a question for each of you to continue the themes that we were exploring. For you first, Dave, yesterday we were in conversation with Caroline, who is a founder of All Good Products, and Dylan Gohill, who is a youth activist with Extinction Rebellion Youth in Los Angeles. And at the end of the conversation, respecting Dylan's commitment to activism, working from the outside, and Caroline really working in the heart of business as their unique ways of thinking about change. What was landing toward the end of the conversation was, does it have to be either or is there actually a path where companies can be activists and activists can work inside the system? And I'm curious, how have you experienced this combination of the inside game, inside business, and the outside game in culture and politics? Have you experienced the opportunity for them to work in concert, or in all sincerity, because you've done so much work with activists, have you found it harder to find the right way of integrating these paths and modes of change?
Well, boy, big question, a lot to unpack there. And I'm not sure whether necessarily the right way to think about it is integration. I mean, there are opportunities for integration, but we're all in an ecosystem together, and we each have our roles to play. From the standpoint of the inside game, and Ben & Jerry's, has always been about changing the nature of business. Ben & Jerry's wouldn't exist if Ben hadn't figured out a way to turn this business into a way to try to create change within the world of business. And we've always tried to do that, and we attract people who believe have a different kind of vision for business than what was conventional, and so we've tried to stay on that path and to be an influence for change within the business world. On the other hand, we're an activist company, and we're trying to use our relationship with our fans to encourage much more activism from the outside, and both are absolutely critical. And so, as you say, I've had this really wild journey in my career on both sides of that so-called divide. And one story that maybe illustrates the way they come together in perhaps not an integrated way, but an oppositional way that still works is you know, I've been in a boardroom. I've been in a group of executives that were grappling with the question of what they should do about palm oil in their products. And there was a whole presentation about why they ought to change and do something different. And, you know, one of the top people in the company turns to the group and says, okay, what I want to know is that going to keep Greenpeace off of our building? And if I had known that we had that kind of power truly when I was an activist with Greenpeace, you know, I don't know whether it really would change anything or not, but I don't think I always had the confidence that I should have had about the kind of change we were capable of making. And so I think there's all of those paths, inside and outside. But it's not going to be, you know, on the inside, it's not going to be from making a new app to solve all of our problems. It's going to be about really changing the way decisions are made in business.
Thank you, Dave. And before I ask a separate question for you, Joe, any builds on what you're hearing or your own thoughts and experience about leveraging inside power or power from business and power from culture and politics, and how they either complement in an ecosystem, as Dave's sharing, or whether there is a way to try to bring activism inside? What comes to mind for you, Joe?
Well, so I love this question because in the 2-3 days I've been here, this is exactly what I've been saying, which is there's a divide, there's a line, right? There are different roles that are being played, but I don't think that's an excuse to allow it to continue to happen. And I think one of the things I've been saying is, yes, you're making these decisions, right? But for example, one of these conferences I recently went to, I was like, you're planning this conference, awesome. What's the youngest person on that planning board? 50? Okay. So how are you going to market to this new generation of people, right? And that was a perfect example, right? Because then I went to this conference and I was like, how there is such a divide between, you are reaching, you know, your business audience of, you know, 40, 50, 60 execs coming in and talking, right? But how are you supposed to reach your audience of 20, 30-year-olds, the biggest demographic of spenders, the biggest demographic of activists, just in general, such a huge market? How are you reaching them if the youngest person making these decisions is 40, right? Like, how are you involving youth? And I've been having this conversation for months now, and it's kind of like 2022 is my time to convince companies to get youth involved, right? But on a whole, like, bigger level, you know, you can't make decisions with the same people. How are you involving frontline communities, not just youth, though that's my big part, but frontline communities directly? How are you involving them? It's not how are you helping them, but how are they helping you? And I was talking to someone and they were telling me about reverse mentoring. I'd never heard of that. And I fell in love with the term, right? Of instead of someone older and wiser mentoring the younger person, let's switch the script. Like, let's flip it. Like, how are you expecting for this older generation to learn if they're not listening from the younger generation? I think what you're saying, Raphael, this question is exactly what I've been pushing, right? And I'm really loving this is, how are you going to involve youth in your conversations, in your direction that the company's headed? You can't continue for the next 10 years to allow people over the age of 40 or 50 to make these decisions, because from a business standpoint, they may know their numbers, but from a social standpoint, they may not know their stuff, right? You're not out in the streets being an activist. You're not talking to your friends, you know, on FaceTime or House Party or Yubo going, hey, you know, how's life going? You're not in that population knowing. You're looking at surveys, you're hiring consulting groups and paying millions of dollars to get these studies done by consulting companies that are then paying focus groups millions of dollars, when really what you could do is just bring in a youth activist who pay them like $1,000 a month and just get their honest opinion. And that's what I've been pushing, right? Is involving, instead of saying we want a youth opinion, just do it. Bring them directly in and go, tell us what you think of this plan. We want to do this marketing stunt for the Super Bowl. What are your thoughts? Dope, awesome, or maybe didn't work as well, right? That's what I've been pushing. And it doesn't work for every company. I think it's a very individualized solution, but some companies need to involve a younger mindset to really get the best outcome.
Well, two things that inspires in me. One is appreciating and welcoming divergent perspectives as a practice. And then two, proximity to the people that you're engaging, whether that's communities that you impact or voice and experience of folks that can help guide how you understand yourself and the impact that you can have. Keeping on with you, Joe, in the experience you're having in these couple of days at the Sea Change sessions, you're in a milieu of many 40, 50, 60 something business leaders who are probably toward the forward edge of thinking about impact. What would you say in the last day or two in your conversations is exciting you? And at the flip side, what questions or concerns are emerging?
You know, this so far, and this is a shameless plug, except I get absolutely nothing out of this, has been my favorite conference that I've ever been to. And the reason I say that is I've been to a lot of conferences and they get a little convention hall, right? And then you stay in the hotel or the resort the entire time. Every single activity, every single meal is local, right? There's snowshoeing, there's skiing, snowboarding. Even putting that aside, there's ice bathing in the frozen lake and then a sauna, right? It's local community activities involving local companies and then local food. And it excites me because that's what I want out of these conferences. And the other plus is it's not 5,000 different people, select group of business leaders who I've yet to meet one of them who doesn't want to make a change, right? And there's not shameless branding all over the place, right? I've barely seen any branding of any company, right? It's a very low key thing. And what I'm loving about this is I'm sitting down with these people I've never met before, and they're listening to me and they're asking me questions like, our company was thinking of doing this. What are your thoughts? And I'm giving them advice, and they're like, that's actually really good advice. So one of the things I'm really hopeful from this is I'm hoping that even me giving some small pieces of advice can show them that having a youth perspective is a very easy solution to getting a new opinion on anything you're doing. And it saves you from a huge PR nightmare if you do an ad campaign or you do any kind of campaign and it goes terrible. One of the things that I struggle with, honestly, with conferences in general, but also just, I think there are always some people here who just, their goal isn't to completely submerge themselves. And I think the other thing is, and this is to no fault of anyone, but change is hard. And it's especially hard in the climate movement. And it's even harder when you need to have super fast change. So one of the hardest things that I've seen is people are not used to just suddenly deciding to do a completely different thing, right? And trying to convince them to let in some kid to advise them is a very tough thing. Like, what do they know, right? And change is the biggest problem, but also the biggest solution to this crisis. So that's like pros and cons, and, a little bit of light and a little bit of dark at the end of the tunnel is change. And that's coming out of this conference is change is a big positive and a big negative here.
Yeah, right on. Thank you. With change is hard, I'd like to ask you some questions, Dave. Mindful that one of the primary issues apart from voting or racial justice, voting dynamics that you're very committed to, but climate is obviously another massive one. And you're designing inside the business. Your products are very heavily reliant on an animal agriculture infrastructure and supply chain. And I'm just curious, how are you thinking about ensuring that the world has access to the ice cream that they love, and at the same time trying to decouple that from what we know can be very harmful from animal ag at scale? So how are you trying to reconcile that? And what does the next chapter of climate leadership look like for Ben and Jerry's?
Yeah. Great question. Obviously, our business is tied to dairy, and dairy is, one of the more significant contributors to greenhouse gas emissions globally, as well as a lot of other environmental burdens. We've been working for over a dozen years with our farmers here in Vermont to help them transform their farming methods in ways that can be beneficial for climate, as well as other impacts, building soil health, which can reduce runoff and water pollution issues, for example. The thing that I'm most excited about is a new project that we're embarking on. We're just about ready to launch it. We're going to be working with about 15 farmers on both sides of the Atlantic, with the goal of actually helping them to, in 3 years, cut their on-farm greenhouse gas emissions in half, with things that we already know how to do. And then, of course, the trick will be, how can we take that learning and go to the rest of our supply chain and throughout the dairy industry. Regenerative agriculture is at the core of that. There's a lot of other technologies and things that now exist that can really drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So one prong of our approach going forward is to do dairy right. The other part is to grow our non-dairy sales. We have a great line of non-dairy frozen desserts. We're now number one in non-dairy and ice cream, but we really need to figure out how we can grow, disproportionately grow those sales so that it's 30, 40, 50% or more of our sales, and that's how we ultimately get to our own science-based targets for greenhouse gas emissions, as well as transform supply chains that can have reach well beyond that.
Cool, thank you. So we have one question from the chat, which is Rob asks, with an appreciation for both of your leadership. The question is where the intergenerational alliances might reside and how you might find these collaborations at scale. So what level of engagement or steps would need to happen in order to build intergenerational alliances and co-creativity inside of what you do? So Dave, why don't you keep the floor, and how might you think about intergenerational alliances and co-creation?
Well, thanks for the question, Rob. And you always come up with good, thoughtful, and hard ones. And it's at the crux of what Joe has been talking about. And I'm going to be honest and say I don't know really the answer. Certainly for us, a lot of the way we have done that is through the NGO partnerships that are central to our activism, and to the extent that those organizations we partner with have significant youth engagement. But we've got to go beyond that. And Joe, I'll just say I'm really open to continuing the dialogue that we've begun to get your advice and help on how we can actually do that. Clearly, it's critical, from a business point of view, and we have ways of trying to understand where Gen Z is and all that. But I think that we need to go deeper, as you've been saying, and I'm all ears.
We, with Joe and with Dylan and with Lex and Yulu and others from the climate and the indigenous rights movements, we have been talking about intergenerational design as a practice. And so I would be thrilled, Dave, to partner with you and Joe and the team of finding ways to concretize this aspiration for solving problems by uniting the wisdom and the creativity and the influence that happens across generations. We're about at time. So Joe, over to you for a closing word. As you've experienced these last 2 days, a great conversation with Dave, one of my sources of inspiration and a great example, I think, to all of us. What's on your mind, and what would be your closing word to the community?
I'm going to start this off by saying this has been an amazing conversation. And Dave, as much as I say, you can always do more Ben and Jerry's, I genuinely love the company. And not just the product. I will say I'm guilty of a couple pints of ice cream, right? But just the mission and the way you guys go about it is very heartwarming to say, right? And there's not a lot of companies that I see making a genuine change and genuinely trying their best to make a difference. And you guys are one of those. So I just want to say congratulations to you guys, right? You guys are doing a good job.
Thanks.
Kind of scaling back, I think exactly what you said, Raphael. And on a more personal level, these climate activists work a minimum wage job to pay for their lives and do activism for free, right? Activism is not a paying job. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying, right? Or they've somehow found a miracle. So what we really need to do is we need to create these partnerships to allow for activists to continue putting pressure on government. It's a three-pronged attack. Local community, business, and government, right? And a lot of activism is around that government, but we need partnerships from businesses and local communities to get into this. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, from what I've seen, is these open dialogues, directly bring someone into the fold to go, we were thinking of this. What are your thoughts? And I will continue to repeat that for the next year, at least, if not for the rest of my life, of bring in those frontline communities to directly tell you what you're saying works, but here's my thoughts, right? Instead of hiring out and getting someone to do discussion or panel groups, directly talk to that one individual and say, we were thinking of this. Tell us your honest thoughts. Be constructive, right? Find the right person who agrees with your guys' vision and just helps you coax it into a better vision, honestly, and the execution of that. I really think that a lot of the brands I've talked to here, and I've said this already, it's beautiful to see just how inspired they are. And putting that aside, how inspired this conference is about honest conversations and genuine dialogues. And one of the things I'm really hoping that a lot of other conferences can pick up is having these youth panels and these youth at the conferences makes a world of difference, right? You can only talk to so many different people at the exact same level in different companies. When you have this completely different perspective, you've never once talked to, right? Activists are the one banging at your doors outside, chanting at you. You're not usually seeing them inside the company talking. It's a whole different dialogue and it's a whole different conversation to be had. And I've enjoyed watching people talk to me and genuinely being surprised that I may actually have an idea of what's going on, and I may actually have a good idea of you could do this to do it better, right?
Right on.
Yeah, that's how I'm going to sign off. Is like, honestly, reach out to me, reach out to Raphael, reach out to Dave, but like take some time to reflect too. Think about local communities, local groups around you, and how you can directly get their input.
Right on. And just to build on that, I feel like there's a lot of things we don't know how to solve. And so to me, it's not only, oh, we have an idea, can you give us feedback? But rather, what are the burning questions that we have to solve together that we don't know the answer to? And whether it's young people or frontline communities or partners across an ecosystem that Dave has shared, I think there's a great opportunity to sit with not knowing, to unlearn patterns that have not served us, and to imagine what could be by weaving the wisdoms together. And so I'll leave it with that. Dave, thank you, sir, for your great leadership as always, and just your humanity, a mensch of the first order. Joe, thank you very much for sharing your experience, but also I think just an incredible amount of enthusiasm and open-mindedness for authentic, meaningful connection and relationship with business. And with that, I just want to thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of the sessions, and we will keep the conversation going. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.